Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars The Clone Wars episode review. This one's going to be for Season 7, Episode 12, Victory and Death. This is the series finale for The Clone Wars, the last episode. So how was it? You guys know I've been very positive about every episode of this final arc. The first part, the second part, the third part, they've all been absolutely incredible. And while I think as an episode, this is very good, I think it's kind of the same quality to the other three. So overall, it's a good arc, yes. But the thing is, this episode also does serve as the series finale. It's the end of this arc and it's the end of the Clone Wars overall. And in that sense, I was actually somewhat disappointed with this as a final episode. And the reason for that is because I feel it ultimately comes down to how much of this episode they devoted to the action versus how much of this episode they devoted to character. And I think they devoted way too much time in this final episode of the series to the action. It was like 18 minutes or so of escape from Order 66, and it left only like 3-4 minutes to act as the epilogue to this show. And as a final episode, for me, I'm looking for the character stuff. I'm looking for the emotional payoff at the end of the series, not the action. And in that sense, like that's the problem here of we got 17 minutes of this action sequence that, while good, tense because of Order 66, and for the most part very good, it was a lot of the same type of stuff that we saw in the third episode, in that I think they only needed to have a relatively small amount of this episode actually continue Order 66 on. I think they would have got more value out of like a bigger action sequence by actually cutting around the galaxy and showing Order 66 from other Jedi's point of view. In a way, part of the weakness of this as a finale is that it's almost too laser focused on just Ahsoka and Rex, when one of the things that the Clone Wars, I think, has done that's been so impressive has been its ability to characterize some of the other Jedi. So, not like cutting over to show Plo Koon, who is important to Ahsoka, and like Wolf, Plo Koon, Wolf, there's a lot of stuff there that you probably should cover. Gregor, some of the other Jedi and so on. Show these kind of moments. Like, you could have shown a clip of like young Kanan during Order 66. Instead, we got what I felt was ultimately a relatively overly protracted like escape sequence, given that a good amount of the previous episode was also part of this like action sequence. In that most of the action did ultimately come down to Ahsoka standing in front of Rex, blocking blaster bolts, him firing stun blasts at them, and little things happen along the way to kind of get in the way. The droids take the floor out to allow them to escape. Maul comes through, and here he is taking out the hyperdrive. Oh, here's Maul again. He's going to steal the ship that we are planning to take. So we're going to have to go down with this ship. That's how we're getting off here, is by surviving the landing. Like, there was a tension to it. They told a bit of a story with the action, but not enough of a story to me to make it worth devoting like 80% of the final episode of the show to. This would have been maybe okay to do that if this was the duel. Like, if this was where you wanted to do your Ahsoka Maul duel, then maybe, yeah, 18 minutes of that, and, then a short epilogue is fine. But the quality of this action, I don't think was particularly great, in my opinion. Not to say it was bad, it's just, was it series finale quality? I don't think so, and I think that's the biggest issue that I have here, is that there was almost too much of a focus on action here. There was, I think, too much of a reliance on just Ahsoka is here. We're not necessarily delving deep into her character and how she feels during this time. It's just she's here, and she's affected by it, but I don't think we're going in deep enough. And I think that's where it comes down to, like, I think most of the pressure of this episode was on those two epilogue scenes. And while I think they're both good, we needed more. For sure. We needed absolutely more, given that this was the series finale. If there was more to come, if there was another arc to basically act as an epilogue, no problem. I'd have absolutely no problem with this. But as far as we know right now, this is the final episode of the Clone Wars. And so I expect a bit more from it. The two scenes that we got are, first of all, it was in the aftermath of everything, a bit of time has passed. We see Rex preparing the ship, and he looks over at a hooded Ahsoka, who is looking over basically the kind of graves of all the clones. And on top of them are obviously their helmets on the sticks or pikes or whatever you want to say. And she just glances down the line of them. You see, of course, that they're her clones. They're the ones with the orange markings on the helmets. And then, of course, Jesse's helmet comes across as well. And that's meant to be the very important one, because he was our named clone who turned on her and is now dead in the crash. That was, that definitely hit. But as Ahsoka's final scene, okay, she drops the lightsaber. If you hadn't read the Ahsoka novel and know that was meant to be, basically symbolic of the idea of she's effectively faking her death, that she's acting like by leaving a lightsaber there, she has died in this crash as well. I like the connection with the next scene with Vader. I just think they needed to have more with Ahsoka. Given how hyped up her return was in the middle arc of this season, and then how incredible it's going to be to see her in this final arc, I was a bit shocked how sort of quickly they just left off. Ahsoka's last scene in the Clone Wars is just drop the lightsaber, cut to Vader. I almost can't believe that they didn't have any sense of a scene of her reflecting on what's just happened, because this is the problem when you cut from heavy action where the character isn't getting a lot of a chance to sort of take in what's happening to them, and then immediately cut to straight away just resolution of things. You don't get to see what the character has kind of been through. And I think that's what happened here, is that I wanted to see Ahsoka talk about how she feels that most of the Jedi Order has been wiped out here. I would have liked to have seen her see the message that Obi-Wan sent out to sort of any surviving Jedi to stay away from Coruscant and the Jedi Temple. That would have been a very powerful scene to just get across to Ahsoka, more than she already knows, just how bad things are. That there's only a handful of survivors. It's nice to see Obi-Wan is alive, but what has happened, and her thinking about, should she have left? Would this have gone differently if she didn't leave? Would this have gone differently if she had told the council in the last episode what Maul told her about Anakin? Those type of things, I think, should be what you're focusing on here, is Ahsoka's feelings as she goes into basically exile, as she goes into hiding after Order 66. I felt they left far too much of this kind of just up in the air of it's Ahsoka, she's going to survive, and there's nothing to talk about. And I think they've relied on this a little bit too much, because I think it's also fair to say that Season 7 didn't really do much with her arc in the middle arc here either. And they didn't do anything there. They didn't really commit to anything on the character development front for the most part over the course of this arc, necessarily, in terms of how she views the council, how she feels about it. And so it's what kind of happened here? Are we just missing an Ahsoka arc that they didn't animate, that did delve into this a little bit more? Or are they relying on, between now and Rebels, and then Rebels itself, to allow this stuff to happen? Either way, I don't think it was the most effective ending in this series for Ahsoka. It ended, like I said, too much on action, and then it felt like it was a bit sort of throw their hands up in the air from the writers of just like, yeah, you know what happens from here on out, you know? She's dropping the lightsaber, she's going into hiding, she'll eventually find her way to the rebellion, and she'll appear in Rebels. And they were just kind of done. After hyping up her return so much, it just was like, really? Like, that to me is just crazy that they left it like that. And I know some people, I've already seen like huge praise for this episode with not a lot of like kind of critical view on it. But the second this cut from the final shot of the episode to the credits and it came up like created by George Lucas, I was just like, whoa, that's how you're ending it? Like, I'll discuss the Vader scene now because I thought it was a very good scene. To cut to suddenly, oh, here's Vader, like some time has passed. We're in the Empire era now. Here are stormtroopers in the Clone Wars. Here's Vader picking up Ahsoka's lightsaber that she just discarded in the last scene. He turns it on and it's Vader holding a blue lightsaber. And that really hit, because I think with Anakin Vader, you can leave it on a note where you can be vague because his arc happens in the show, in the movies and so on. You don't need to hit it as hard here because just seeing Anakin as Vader in the Clone Wars is enough. Whereas with Ahsoka, I think you actually did need to have scenes exploring her feelings on things to act as the ending of the show rather than just leaving both characters with sort of a silent, like, unsaid ending. But yeah, like that was a great shot. Anakin holding that blue blade, just highlighting that this is him, I think, before he's completely gone. Before he is the way he is when he sort of has some of those showdowns with Ahsoka in Rebels, where there's still that sense of good in him. Blue is his color usually, and here he is, holding the blades that he gave to Ahsoka, and it's just, there's something to that that I think just works so well, and you get the sense that this is relatively early, I think, in his time as Vader, and he's not fully gone yet. That, highlighting that Ahsoka, I think this arc, the one thing they probably did hit on this is that Ahsoka probably could have helped Anakin through this. Like, this might not have happened had she been able to talk to Anakin before everything went down the way it did. Which is why I don't know why there was no sort of sense of going back to potentially the regrets of Ahsoka over what happened, everything that's happened since season 5. Kind of baffled that they didn't touch on it really all that much. But also, I think more subtle than that, I love that, like, as Vader kind of walks off screen, they linger on the clone helmet in the snow. Just utterly discarded, not important, not deemed worthy enough even to take out of the snow. That is how little Vader cares about clones. The Empire don't use them anymore. Stormtroopers are here now. And clones, which have been sort of in a way like the heart and soul of this series, don't matter anymore. And that is actually a good note to end on. I think in that sense of like ending the Clone Wars with the idea of the clones don't matter. They served their purpose, which was just to fight in a fake war and then kill the Jedi and then be discarded. That is the tragedy of the clones and why it's sort of important that Ahsoka survived. Rex survived. But it's also kind of like, wait, in Rebels there's Wolf and Gregor. Not gonna explain them, even though Wolf is Plo Koon's commander and Gregor was a clone commando? Like, no? Okay. And that's why I just wish we had seen something like that. Like, given that you used like 18 minutes of this episode to have the remaining Order 66 sequence, why not show what's going on the other battlefield? Like, how did Wolf get his chip out? Like, who got it out? How on earth did that actually happen? And, like, is it a case of, like, wait, are they now going to basically have to explain it that Rex, when he goes his own way, finds some of these other clone commanders and gets their chips removed to free them? Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense, because that's one of the biggest retcons in a way from Rebels, is that they had Rex have to get it removed like in the middle of Order 66. So what happened with those other two who are there in Rebels? And I think that's the other thing with this is, like, say, Maul. He's a kind of important part of this arc as well. Like the big duel in episode 2, his capture, the release in episode 3, him going on a rampage across these last 2 episodes. He's been an important part of this arc and the Clone Wars itself. Yet we came into this arc without explaining how he really came back. I know there was a line in, like, what was it, the first episode, I think, of the arc, or was it the second, where he did explain that, like, oh, you guys got me out, to his Maul Mandalorians. But it felt like they were relying on that you've read that comic, whereas they didn't. And then similarly, he escapes here on the ship in a pretty important moment, which leaves Rex and Ahsoka to have to kind of crash on the ship. And that's just where his arc ends here in the Clone Wars. There's no, like, I'm going to Dathomir, back to my home. And I don't think they could. Because if they had referenced stuff from Son of Dathomir, it wouldn't have hit as hard because we didn't see that. We don't know how tragic that those events were for him. That it was the death of Towson. That was the arc where Towson reveals herself to be Maul's mother. We didn't get that stuff. And so it would have been weird almost to have it be said like that, but you kind of had to do that because, like, we have to track the progress of the Darksaber. Like, he didn't have it here, he had it in Son of Dathomir, so it must have been left on Dathomir. So he has to go back and get that to set up the stuff of him as the Crimson Dawn leader, and then to set up where he is in Rebels, basically. So it's moments like that, the fact that we never in this series went back to Ventress, who ultimately was a very important character, because Season 3 was a very important season for the Clone Wars, because it was where it shifted from being sort of more, each arc is just wherever we kind of need it to be almost, and they decided to tell more stories, actually go into characters, have more multi-part episodes that tell important arcs with the characters. And Ventress was right there as being one of the first, and we continued that as the seasons progressed, and we just never came back to her. And especially knowing that they have such incredible arcs for her with the Dark Disciple novel, which is great, but probably should be in the show. I think there's definitely going to be a demand for more of this stuff, to go back and maybe do another Ahsoka on her own arc, to animate Son of Dathomir, animate Dark Disciple, and really have it deliver for all of the Clone Wars characters. Because I think that's probably the thing that is most kind of frustrating about this, is that you'd almost be critical of this episode for almost focusing maybe too much on Ahsoka. That, like, yes, Ahsoka was the main character of the Clone Wars, but she wasn't in every episode. There were episodes where we focused on some of the other Jedi, like, Kit Fisto, like Plo Koon, and they were important. The idea was that it was covering everyone involved in the Clone Wars, and while Ahsoka was our main new character to focus on, we had these other ones as well, including our more Clone Wars specific characters like, villains like Ventress, like the return of Maul. And yet we're ending on this note of being kind of vague about some of these ideas. So you're seeing the fact that this is not this, like, perfectly planned season 7 here. That for a lot of people, I think, this last arc kind of has been the only one that's really, really, truly delivered. And the rest were just okay. And I think that's why I feel I have to point out why I feel relatively disappointed with this as a finale, because it doesn't feel like it's the end of the Clone Wars, because there's still so much else that realistically needs to be told. And while they did as great of a job as they possibly could, it's this weird dynamic where they both at the same time didn't focus enough on Ahsoka in a character sense, but arguably focused too much on her just being on screen. And I think they nearly had it. Like, if you had just delved a little bit more into Ahsoka's emotions here in some of those epilogue scenes, I think it would have hit home that little bit harder. As it is, I've watched those sequences at the end a few times now, and it doesn't feel satisfying to me, like, in any way. I know in a sense thematically it's not really meant to, because it's meant to be this dark moment for the character, but from a, writing character perspective, it felt like they just ended a little bit too much on sort of Ahsoka being stoic and not really, in a way, like, showing any emotion about what happened, when the whole point, in a way, of her arc that they didn't really cover that well was that she's meant to be more emotional. She's not meant to be the one who, like Obi-Wan, can always put her emotions aside when needed. So why didn't you go into that? And that's the major thing that I have here, is that it almost feels like they were, like, afraid almost to delve into some vulnerability, some emotion for Ahsoka here, because they wanted to make sure that she remained strong. And the thing is, even if she had shown emotion, like, I think people would still always consider her strong because of how impressive she was over the course of this arc, because of the entire rest of the series, basically. That, it just felt like they were a little all over the place in the end here, and they could have done it better just by maneuvering some of the time around a little bit better. But yeah, like, in terms of, like I said, the action, I haven't really talked about it that much at the start. Like, I liked moments like Ahsoka and Rex talking, and then her taking off the helmet, and it's revealed that he's actually crying. That, he's trying to almost convince her that, like, we're going to have to kill them if we want to get through this. But her saying, like, no, we're not going to. I know why they are this way, and I can't bring myself to do that. I won't be the one to kill them. That was, I think, pretty strong in how he agreed to it, and he set his blasters to stun from there on out. There was a really cool action moment where Ahsoka throws both of her lightsabers into the ground still on, and then uses the Force to spin them around in a circle to cut through the floor. The droids being, like, executed by the clones was actually a surprisingly, like, whoa, like, powerful moment, because they were so heavily on Ahsoka's side. I thought that worked out quite well as a bit of a sort of sacrifice in the middle of this, to highlight that the clones are kind of more brutal when they're under Order 66. Similarly, like, Jesse and Rex having that discussion about, like, she's not actually a Jedi, obviously just a distraction, but seeing Jesse, who's previously been one of our, like, nicer clones in a way, always part of the team, and just seeing him be all about the rules, like, you're a traitor, I'm in command now, this is what we're doing, that there's no hope for him, there's no convincing him, unless they can get the chip out, there's no hope for him, but there's no time, there's no opportunity to make that happen. And that's what makes Jesse's death in the end pretty tragic, of, like, our named clone within this episode who we saw be killed. But yeah, like, beyond that, like I said, it was tense. There was a good atmosphere because it was Order 66, and, like, you saw, like, Ahsoka take a few glancing blows on her, like, gauntlets on her wrists. Rex took a shot in the pauldron, I think, that they were barely staying in this fight. And then, like, Maul, of course, you just see him, like, running roughshod through everything once again. And it was very impressive use of the Force, with him bringing in the hyperdrive as well. But yeah, like I said, in general, I like a lot of what's in this episode. And if it was just an episode, I'd be really, really singing the praises of this one. It's just, I don't think it hit the notes as much as it needed to as a finale. Knowing what we know right now, which is that it doesn't seem like we are going to be getting anything more. We don't know if there'll be any sort of media, whether it be another animated series, whether The Mandalorian will show it through flashback, or what, covering any Ahsoka stuff after this, in terms of, like, post-Order 66. So that's where some of that disappointment comes in. But in general, I was so glad that the Clone Wars came back for this final season. And while it wasn't perfect, it was great to sort of experience these last 12 episodes with the fandom, especially this last arc, and seeing how excited everyone has been about pretty much everything going on. But they're my thoughts on this final episode of the Clone Wars. I will have another video coming out where I talk more about sort of Season 7 and kind of more my general thoughts on the Clone Wars overall as a whole, coming out, I suppose, later on this week. So look out for that as a sort of like wrap-up video on the Clone Wars itself. But in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the episode. Did you really like it, like I've seen a lot of people say, or were you also a little bit disappointed in it as a finale like I was? Let me know, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.